Welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. Hello, Louie.
Hi, Matt. How you doing?
I'm doing just well, and tonight's going to be an episode with a guest, a real live guest joining us over Skype. I believe, and you know Taner better than I do, but it's Dr. Taner, or Professor Taner Edis, who's at Truman State University in Missouri. And we'll be discussing probably a whole range of things. And I know I'll want to ask the question of why the universe exists in the first place. So welcome, Taner. Please answer these questions. Here's my naive question. Why does the universe exist?
Well, a quick answer for that would be, why not?
It's the kind of answer that Louie would give me. But he would take a lot longer to tell me that. Go on, tell me more.
In all seriousness, the question, why does the universe exist, sort of implies that you've got these options of universe doesn't exist or exists in one form or another, and why do one of these forms of existence or non-existence happens to be the one we have. Now, you can try to answer something like this at the level of, say, try to do our best physics and cosmology to the extent that we know about these things. And that will get you somewhere, but you will always run into the question of, say, if you're explaining the current cosmology on the basis of our understanding of fundamental physics, then you're always going to run up on the question of, well, what if the fundamental physics was different? Because that could have been different. So you're never going to have some sort of logically airtight, it couldn't have been otherwise type of answer. At some level, you have to say that, well, this is the way things are, as best as we can tell. Maybe one of these days we can figure out some sort of deeper reason, but with what we have right now, this is as far as we can go. And right now, you can ask a cosmologist, and they can tell you all sorts of interesting things about the history of the universe as a whole. But if you're going to ask someone why this and not something totally different or nothing at all, I don't think you should prepare yourself for a compelling answer. You can talk to say, a metaphysician, and what they will give you is going to be something based on their metaphysical intuition about what ought to be. But personally, my view of that is these metaphysical intuitions are worth exactly what you pay for them. It's just somebody pulling something out of their ass. So we just, at a certain level, we just don't know. And there are certain questions which there's a good prospect that it's not really a very good question, not the sort of thing that you can know. And I kind of suspect this, why is there something rather nothing question is one of those.
Sure. Taner, if I could ask then, so we don't, I mean, I totally agree with you there, if that's not a sycophancy. But
a little bit.
So, and also adding in God into that mix doesn't really help us anymore either.
No, I don't think so, because eventually, if you're thinking of saying God did it as an explanation of things, clearly we can't really make that into a substantial explanation in the way a cosmological theory is these days, in a way as to explain why this sort of universe rather than some other type of universe or nothing at all. It would come down to saying, well, since typically people conceive of a God in sort of personal terms, it's going to be something having to do with the character of this God or the whims of this God or something like that. And you're really not being very informative when you start saying things like this. I mean, it would have been one story if we had some really good, solid evidence about the gods or something like that, and we knew something about their personalities, and so we could really explain things by referring to their psychological characteristics, their desires, and things like that. But we have nothing like that, so it ends up being a non-explanation. So not very interesting in certain ways.
Sure, but I mean, do you think? I mean, I know I agree with you there, but there is a slight irksome why the universe gets out of bed in the morning, I do think it is one of those. It is an irksome question. Whether the answer is it does, it is a bit weird, isn't it? Would you agree with that, or?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. In the sense that some of the weirdness we put onto it, I think, may be artificial. In the sense that we're sort of pushing the questions beyond what our evidence, our understanding can really answer to, and perhaps can even possibly answer to. And in that sense, it's weird, yes. But we also may be making the mistake that just because it's very maybe meaningful to ask the question of, say, why does my car start in the morning? And you can concoct an explanation that's satisfying for that, doesn't necessarily mean that when you're talking about everything as a whole, it's really the same sort of question.
Sure.
And I want to ask the question then in relation to, and I think, Louie, you may have done a recent blog post that links this idea of, is the past infinite? So if we're going back to look at this idea that to think, and I'm representing the layperson here, to suggest that, okay, then we're told that the universe essentially, I'm going to use the word in inverted commas, began, or something happened that we refer to as the Big Bang, and that's where it all started, and we can do lots and lots of science or theories about what's happened since that. Then if I ever ask the question, so why the Big Bang then? Why did that happen? What happened before it? What triggered it? Whatever. Are they, again, all questions which are just not appropriate to ask?
Well, no, they're appropriate enough to ask, because there at least you have some sort of physical context in which we can ask these questions. But you just have to be prepared for the fact that the answers that you're going to get from physicists these days are going to have a very large measure of speculation in them. And the reason for that is sometimes we don't really see this very well in media coverage of science, but actually what we know about basic physical cosmology is actually rather limited. In the sense that what we can reasonably guarantee today for you, given the astrophysical evidence, is that in the past, the universe as a whole, as we see it, was in a much hotter, much denser, much smaller state. And how you can extrapolate beyond that depends very much on what the appropriate theoretical context you're going to put these observations in. And we really do not have an adequate theoretical context for that these days, particularly because we do not have a good theory of quantum gravity on our hands. So no matter what you do about questions like extending time backwards beyond the Big Bang, you are going to have to start becoming rather speculative and kind of anticipate the shape of what a successful quantum gravity theory might look like. And therefore, it's all going to be very uncertain at a certain level. So yeah, I mean, people will have all sorts of ideas in play in cosmology right now. You will have versions of ideas where you do not necessarily need to extend space and time infinitely into the past. So you have you can have scenarios where you have a beginning in some ways for space and time, even though that is not really something that maps very well onto our everyday ideas of what a beginning is. You can still have a non-extensible space-time, not infinitely extensible space-time backwards. Or you can play with ideas, say, for example, with string theory these days. It's one of the candidates, though it hasn't been very productive at all. It's one of the candidates for trying and putting quantum mechanics and gravity together. And in some versions of string theories, if you make a certain number of assumptions and some speculation about what the shape of an adequate theory might look like, you end up with a situation where you can extend time backwards infinitely. And one of the reasons for that is in string theory, you have a minimum length scale. So you can't have anything like the classical Big Bang that we had a generation ago, where everything really would collapse onto a single mathematical point. So you actually can have something where you can extend it back infinitely in time. But again, as I said, these are very speculative. At a certain point, I think we have to acknowledge that these are interesting questions, but our ability to answer these in a rather sort of disciplined intellectual way is rather limited, and probably will always be limited to a certain extent. We kind of have to deal with that.
And in some way, then, would these be questions then that, one thing I'm taking what you're saying, that they're not necessarily questions for physicists, or are they more the theoretical physicists, where there are in spaces of speculating about how this, how this may work, and we're going beyond what we can actually observe, or are we going beyond physics altogether with some of those kind of questions? And by the questions, I'm not necessarily the questions in terms of the ones you've been focused on, what we can look in physics, but the kind of question that a naive person like me has to say, why on earth, like what Louie would ask, why does the universe go to the bother of existing? That's a question which not really a physicist is in a position to even attempt to ask. You have to go beyond those realms to either go to places of faith, metaphysics, things which, like you say, from a scientist's point of view, is, well, they're only worth so much for if you believe what someone's saying. They're not basing it on anything other than their own intuitions.
To a certain extent, but I wouldn't be too hard and fast, too definite about it. And the reasons are somewhat like this. First, you mentioned theorists. My background is as a theoretical physicist. So I think of theory as physics as much as anything. And speculation, making things up and trying to see if you can get something that's workable out of it, this is quite a normal part of physics. And if you're working at questions that are unresolved at the cutting edge, there's always going to be a certain amount of speculation in what you're doing. You just want to do it in a rather disciplined way that eventually can be kind of reality checked one way or the other. But it is also an area, when you're dealing with questions like this, where the boundary between theoretical physics and, say, certain kinds of speculative philosophy become rather blurred. It's in some ways the distinction between somebody who's trying to approach such questions from a philosophical point of view and from a physical point of view, the distinction becomes a little bit artificial at a certain point, more of an artifact of our kind of academic boundaries between disciplines more than anything else. So, yeah, things get fuzzier, things get more speculative, but that's what you expect to happen. Physics have sharp boundaries.
And not somewhere where we're expected to find, say, a God of the gaps. I mean, we're not thinking that those areas are a place where God can creep in. I mean, we're happy with the universe being a natural object. Is that right, Taner, would you say?
By and large, yes, as in people who work on physical cosmology. I do have to say I'm not a physical cosmologist. I'm talking to you as somebody who's knows about the physics that most every physicist knows about. But physical cosmologists, to my knowledge, which I think is pretty good, really don't do God all that much. It's basically physics. And one of the reasons for this is sort of what we were mentioning a little bit earlier, in that saying God did it and actually trying to construct a decent explanation of what's going on out of it, a kind of explanation that can legitimately rule out some kinds of universe and say our kind of universe was maybe more likely because of the whims of the gods. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. Right now, it would be one of those approaches that would be considered to have no real prospect whatsoever of success. So it really ends up being a situation where it's not in the picture at all. By and large, we deal with the universe as a whole as a natural thing. And even if you reach the point where you're reduced to say, this is it's pretty much random, this is how it is, that type of explanation has become much more regular in modern physics as well. Not just because we have reached the point where we are much more comfortable with the idea that explanations have to reach an end, but also because physicists have gotten much more used to dealing with sheer randomness over the past century or so. So you kind of have to say that we push things as far as we can. We know that it can never be in some sort of super ultimate, absolutely explain everything kind of state. That's literally unreachable. So you're always going to have to be comfortable with some degree of uncertainty about whatever explanation you come up with, whether it's something small and everyday or whether you're talking about the universe as a whole. You have to accept that we always will have a certain degree of ignorance when approaching these things. And you also have to accept that on top of everything, even when you account for all that, sometimes the universe just acts at random, that things happen without any reason or cause or anything like that. And this is actually quite normal. So you kind of, if your idea of explaining things, of doing science is basically to sort of uncover absolutely everything and acquire some sort of godlike knowledge, you're going to be disappointed.
Absolutely, and I'm quite happy to accept my ignorance. So thank you for that.
Yep, I think that was brilliant. Thank you, Taner. That was brilliant.
Thank you. We've given us lots to ponder on. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Okay.